Welcome to our last session of the day. I am chatting with Ashely Horvat. Ashely is the Vice President of Auto OEMs at Greenlots for our fireside chat, Start Your Motors. So we're really excited to be talking about EVs and e-mobility. Ashely, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I wish I had something that felt more firesidey. This is great. I love it.
That's okay. So let's just get right into it because I have a long list of questions for you and we're definitely going to take up the full amount of time. Let's start by talking about what's different with the mobility marketplace today versus a few years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of things that have fluctuated in our overall environment in general, which of course impacts mobility. What we've seen change, I think, specifically pertains to cities. And I think, more and more, obviously with the pandemic, people aren't taking TNCs as much. So that's a huge shift. I think in terms of overall mobility, we're still seeing, a lot of the progress that we've made has been movements, right? It's not a moment, it's a movement. So we're still investing, we're still seeing investments from the automakers. They've been investing, over the last decade, even sometimes preceding that into the technology. So I think that still continues apace. There are some impacts to the operation of manufacturing facilities and, cities. I've seen people that are typically dedicated to mobility and climate change being reallocated to deal with the pandemic. And so I think, resources are dwindling and they're becoming more and more important. But I also think that, we're surrounded by smoke. We're seeing hurricanes galore. And so that is even more emphasizing the mobility and pressing, all of the stakeholders that are involved to move quicker. And I think, if anything, it's definitely shifting the way we move on a day-to-day basis, unfortunately, to more, single passenger vehicles from safety perspective. But I think overall the movement is just accelerating. So I think mobility has changed in that certain stakeholders that are in the private sector have been more involved as opposed to, in the past, we were definitely seeing more of the regulators and some of the public sector agencies really pushing the envelope. And now we're kind of seeing the confluence of, both the private sector investment coming to fruition and then also the public sector becoming more educated on some of the technical aspects, the commercial readiness. So I think it's all it's converging and it's also accelerating. Those are the two things that I would summarize.
Let's talk more about the public actors. How have they been behaving differently?
Yeah, like I said, I think that they're definitely becoming more engaged and aware of business models. I think when I started in the public sector, we were pressing the utilities, we were pressing the OEMs, the automakers, the VSC providers to really push the envelope. And that was, a decade ago. And now we're kind of seeing a little bit of tension, I would say, in the sense that the light duty market has taken off. There's still some lessons learned there in terms of where we put infrastructure. But I think right now the public sector is grappling with how can they contribute in a really conducive way that helps move the market. And like I said, they're becoming more educated. There's more regulatory aspects of it, like in the medium heavy duty space, where California passed a momentous law recently, which is requiring a certain amount of medium heavy duty sales. So I think, the public sector involvement is changing in that previously we were pioneering certain aspects of the mobility movement and specifically electrification. And now utilities have really put forth very sophisticated programs that impact their long-term planning. I think the other thing I would just say is that, in the earlier days when I was at the state of Oregon, I always felt like an island, right? Like I felt I was always the persistent one pushing these things. And, I represented different agencies, but from the internal mechanics of the agencies, there really wasn't people throughout the agency that were representative of electrification, right? I was the sole person responsible for quite a bit of action. Now what we're seeing is both in the public and the private sector, from utilities to state agencies, there are representatives within each vertical where you can receive assistance from, a planner as well as somebody that's actually going out to the field. And so I think it's just emboldening people within each of the organizations in every single department that this is where we're moving. This is the transition to electric transportation. And so it's actually making it go further faster because you have more people that are empowered to take real action.
And that's a result, it sounds like that's a result of public sector and private sector working together better. Would you say that's true? And kind of, do you have any other thoughts on how the public sector and private sector can work together better?
Yeah, I think that they're working together better. There's more forums, there's more engagement. I think some of the tension is that because we are at an inflection point, and I'll just speak specifically about electrification, we are at an inflection point in that the competition is arising and more players are getting engaged. So I don't want to say that that's superseding the need for public engagement. It's just making it more tactical. And so there needs to be more communication. And sometimes it's hard, like coming from a previous public sector employee, it's hard because you don't want to have a conflict of interest, but you also want to make a difference, right? So you want to be communicative, so you're constantly grappling with those diverging needs. So you're trying to be innovative. So there's just ways to kind of go about it, from selecting which agencies, for example, make sense to lead the charge, whether that's the Department of Transportation, so, or is that the regulatory agency that monitors clean air. In terms of how they can work together, I think it's just being more tactical about what funding is available where. So using an example about a project that we've worked on with Volvo Light, it's important to have the make-ready utility funding available to help do the utility interconnection. But there's also investment coming from the private sector, where we might be able to fund the infrastructure through some sort of like charging as a service model. So I think it's just making sure that the communication channels are open with the respective utility, state, public sector, local, whoever it is, to understand where they can fill in the gaps. And we're constantly trying to provide that feedback, right? So like, if there's some sort of strange prohibition where, like a Fortune 1000 company can't be involved because there's the perception that, they have all of this funding. Well, even if you're a multi-billion-dollar company or utility, you still see reticence with investing right now because we are at a stage in the market where it is a lot of upfront capital costs. So I think it's important to just be as inclusive as possible in who you accept in being involved in these projects, because sometimes it's the least expected place that you find engagement. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does. In the broader context of kind of mobility in smart cities, a lot of utilities are at the point where they're rolling out mobility pilots or projects. Where are they in terms of testing and evaluating these projects?
Yeah, some utilities are further down the line than others. So a good example of that would be Southern California Edison, who just released the biggest utility program, Charge Ready. It's $436 million, and that's actually phase 2, right? So phase 1, there was like 20+ million, and it was completely subscribed. So they saw that there was a lot of engagement. So I think they're further along to understanding like what the needs are from the fleet, because there's the OEM, the automaker, and then there's also the fleet, and each of them have different needs and different capabilities to run programs, right? So I think like what we're hearing from large fleets such as ETS and FedEx and even the OEMs on the Volvo group, like there was a interview with Keith Brandis, who's with Volvo, and he was basically saying we need one account manager for the utility projects. Like these large fleets really need to have that expertise built in-house at the utility. And then I had seen an interview with FedEx, one of their managing directors, who basically said that, they have been evaluating the TCOs for quite some time, since early 2010. And where he is the most focused on right now, and FedEx is the most focused on, is utilities, because they see that utilities, not only the time frame for the utility interconnection, we're seeing really long lead times to get infrastructure in, but also where utilities can help bridge the gaps on the cost. So what we're finding is that for a medium heavy duty project, you really need to get ahead and put the infrastructure in as much as you can ahead of the vehicle, because the auto OEMs are trying to grapple with where to put their product and how to scale in certain regions of the country. So it's not as simple as snapping your fingers and saying, there's a utility program, hey, we have a fleet customer here, you really have to do quite a bit of planning, and then on both the vehicle side as well as the infrastructure. So the tightness with which the utilities and the automakers and the providers such as Greenlots work together has to be pretty central. Throughout the country, you've got, in Texas, I know you're near and dear to your heart. CPS Energy is doing great work, Paula and the team in City of San Antonio, to kind of advance the next stage of their own electrification effort. CenterPoint is another really great partner. Other parts of the country, NYPA and BGE, Baltimore Gas and Electric, and Xcel Energy, Duke, AEP in Ohio. The utilities throughout the country, Portland General Electric, some of them are really kind of playing that leadership role for cities, where you talk about smart cities. The utilities are actually it's really important that they're engaging in the planning efforts, right? Because they know where the 480 volt transformers are. They know the times of day that they want the cars or the trucks to charge. So I think utilities have realized, that they need to be in the driver's seat with that as much as possible.
It's really interesting because I'm very interested in mobility, and it used to feel like progress in this space was really dependent upon the region of the country where your utility was. But you just mentioned utilities across the nation, so it sounds like there's a lot more momentum in this space, because it's not just on the West Coast where it really felt like it used to be before.
No, absolutely not. Even we're working with Mid-American is another example, where we're building 18 sites that's going to be done in the next, couple of months. And those are DC fast chargers. So I think the utilities across the country, regardless of their geographic areas, realize that it's finally getting to the point, because it hasn't been easy. It's not like magically these utilities, got engaged. It has taken some time. And honestly, it has taken the West Coast utilities to lead on this, and groups like EEI, the Edison Electric Institute, are really great at kind of spreading the information, really creating these forums where they can engage across different utilities. So I definitely think that has helped make a lot of progress on this.
So another large part of smart cities and mobility is fleet electrification, which we've heard a lot of sessions touch on today, but you helped put together a report on sustainable fleets. What were some of the key findings of that report?
Yes, I would highly recommend the people who are watching this to download the report. It was spearheaded by GNA, and they brought together a pretty amazing, impressive array of partners, including Shell, which Greenlots is a part of, as well as Daimler Truck, and Penske, another partner of ours, and Exelon as well was a supporting sponsor. So it had a really good a menagerie, if you will, of partners that really put together a great report. So the key findings, I think are very promising. Sustainable fleets in general are growing at an exponential rate. Sustainability, whereas I would say in the past, it could be kind of captured as a nominal part of the equation for a fleet operator, has really become a top motivator. And it's not just because of the environmental reason, but it's also because of the technology. I think having access to the technology in general, all of that new technology is going into the sustainable options coming out of the auto OEMs. And I think the fleets are starting to see the writing on the wall, so they want the latest and greatest that can help optimize their own fleets. The other thing that it's to that point is that, the sustainable technology is not a trend. Like, I think we've all kind of gotten past that, which is actually really reassuring, and also just sort of like, it's easy to kind of go back to my memory and remember where it was an uphill battle, and it still is an uphill battle, but I think more so now it's on the logistics and kind of the tactical day-to-day, how do we get this done, as opposed to that uphill battle of like convincing these fleets that it's a thing. And then also we have more options, right, for them to choose from. And then I think the other finding is just on the renewable fuels. And I think fleets are very, educated on the TCO, and also just kind of what goes into fueling their fleets. So it's definitely a confluence of renewable energy technology meets, the need to get their hands on the latest and greatest technology from the vehicle standpoint that helps them minimize the costs of ownership.
I do want to backtrack a little bit because I'm realizing that, I've heard of fleet electrification and then you mentioned hydrogen, but I haven't really heard anyone use the term sustainable fleets. So is that a mixture of these technologies? Like, what is a sustainable fleet?
Yeah, so it's a mixture of the technologies, but it's also, from the standpoint, I mean, now that we're within Shell, we have access to a lot more information and understanding. We have a fleet solutions group. So, you oftentimes you have your fleet manager where they're not going to snap their fingers and be able to just transition their fleet. So it's like, what's sustainable from a business standpoint, from the fuel that powers that? Can they actually have some sort of dashboard view where they can see their energy costs? They can sort of work with the utility to sort of manipulate when they charge, get more. I mean, a lot of fleets are actually starting to become more and more aware of KWH. Like they don't know, that's a totally new type of fuel for them. So I think, across, and we've talked a lot about medium heavy duty trucks, because that's what I'm most engaged in, but there's also transit and refuge trucks, utility trucks. I think urban delivery, I know we're going to potentially talk about that later, but that's a really interesting component because not only does it change the technology and, I guess the cleanliness of what it's outputting, it also changes the way they do operations. So an e-commerce fleet can now, because it's an electric vehicle, actually reorient how they do business. And so sustainable is kind of a catch-all term, but it does encompass more beyond just the way that it plugs in or the way that it refuels.
So we are going to talk about e-commerce and electrification, but real quick for the audience, we're about to wrap up our questions. So submit your questions for Ashely to answer using the chat on the bottom right-hand corner. Okay, Ashely. Yes, over the past few months, COVID, everybody is ordering everything online and getting it shipped to their houses, and just e-commerce has grown exponentially. How does electrifying e-commerce fleets kind of change or impact cities and communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think you called it, the demand is skyrocketing for electric mobility for e-commerce. And I think, so I guess if you look at the reasoning behind that, part of it is the battery range has long been a concern for fleets, and that has improved very dramatically, both on the cost and also just the improvement on the actual performance. I think the economic advantages are another motivation for these fleets in e-commerce. And so you've seen Amazon has purchased, everyone's seen that they purchased 100,000 Rivian trucks in the future. So it's interesting because you're seeing kind of the incumbent manufacturers, but also you're seeing a lot of startups. So you've got, I mentioned Rivian, but you also have Ford, who's coming out with a Transit, which I think is going to be extremely impactful because that's the best-selling currently the best-selling the Transit van is currently the best-selling vehicle in that class. The other one is UPS put in an order for 10,000, I think, or so for the Arrival, and again, a startup. And I'm trying to think, Daimler made an announcement recently. I think Tesla is even, gosh, what is Tesla not getting into? But there's also Change, Lordstown, Exos. I'm trying to think. There's so many, but then there's also Daimler I mentioned already. So what's interesting is because you're seeing kind of even incumbent fleets such as FedEx. I mean, they're a global organization, right? But they are also looking at different types of OEMs. So I think there's a flurry of activity, there's a flurry of excitement. But I will say that we still have a long way to go. But I think what's interesting to these fleets is we're finally at that point where we can start to talk about the scale. We all talk about scale, but it is so important for companies like Greenlots, but it's also important for everybody else in the value chain to really not just be creating these products that are bespoke, but really be thinking about how can we actually get this to a point where you don't just need specific people that are advancing this as a movement, but it's just part of how we do business, right?
Can you kind of describe this vision of what you think the future of electrified e-commerce looks like? Like, I'm envisioning much quieter streets, cleaner and quieter streets, but I'm sure there's much more to that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this point, back in the archaic days when we could like actually get together for drinks, and we had a women of EVs get together. I'll give a shout out there in Seattle, and the place that we always meet they can open up the door. And I remember like delivery trucks were going by in the city, and every time a delivery truck went by, it was just this awkward sound, and it just muffled everybody's conversation, and it was loud, and it just smelled horrible. And so just the thought of being able to replace that in general and really be thinking about, I mean, even in the pandemic, we're thinking about how do we reorient streets for dining, right? So I think it is forcing the issue to really think about how cities are structured. But in terms of e-commerce, I mean, I think what excites us, what excites the fleets is it's that integrated technology vehicle is what we're pushing for from a connected vehicle standpoint. So that comes from, being able to pull up to the charger, and it's a wonky term, but ISO 15118, which is like being able to connect to the charger with the vehicle, and the vehicle talks to the charger. Minimizing as much friction as possible, I think is really exciting. And then I think just the idea of questioning the way that these last mile vehicles run is really important, in thinking about where the depots are placed. And even outside of the city, I think we talk about certain regions that are impacted the most in these times, especially nowadays with air quality. And sometimes it's not just the city that benefits, right? It's also the periphery that goes around those cities, and the community, and then the region. And so, you're having impacts not just to your operation in terms of minimizing the cost, but you're also creating a system in which the providers are also supporters of the city itself, the livelihood of the city. So we're all so reliant on each other nowadays. And so I think, I think that e-commerce becoming so prevalent, we're all at home more and ordering things online more. So if we can have them delivered electric, all the more better.
And even when this pandemic eventually ends, we're still facing, we were talking about this before we went live, now you can't go outside because the air quality is so bad. So even if it's not the pandemic keeping us inside, at this point it may be wildfires. And so it just seems reasonable to assume that e-commerce is just going to keep with this uptick, because people are going to be spending more times in their homes and not going outside as often.
Yeah, and I think it even, especially in California, where they've been having to deal with power outages and just all sorts of issues related to the number of issues that we've had, where the utility communication with the consumers, and their power is all the more critical. And then when we're actually relying on that as a transportation source, where we need to get from point A to point B, and sometimes it's a life or death issue, it's really important that we emphasize reliability and a sophisticated interaction between all of the partners, because this is going to fuel our economy. And so if we don't take it seriously, and if we don't get it right, it could really impact everything, because the more connected we get, the more reliant we get on each other. And so if anything fractures in that system, we can see the implications that much more. So that's what keeps me up at night, amongst the smoke and everything else.
So here's a question from the audience, which maybe you just touched on it a little bit, but it's, what role do you see e-mobility playing in economic recovery?
Oh man, I see it playing a huge role. I mean, we've been participating a lot in those conversations as it pertains, specific legislation, of course, and stimulus and that kind of a thing, without getting specifically into that. But honestly, I got my career started in the Recovery Act, which was in 2009 when that was passed, the ARA bill. And I think a lot of people in the electric vehicle industry really got their start during that time, right? Where it was funding school upgrades, from lighting efficiency to the West Coast Electric Highway, which is where, I got my start in my career. And I think that it's going to be so important, because it not only engages the electricians, right? You also have utility engagement. You've got the infrastructure, from the roads to, it touches so many aspects of the industry. And I think the more we know now, we've learned so many lessons from the previous recovery, to where I believe that any money that is spent going forward will be much more intelligently managed, is the number one thing, because I think that we could have improved that. The other thing I think is that we have more data on what is needed. And as long as we work together as much as possible to ensure, I think it'll be good for the economy.
So here's another question. What mobility technology are you excited about but don't feel like is getting enough attention?
There's really nothing that isn't getting attention. It seems like everything in our economy or everything in our industry is getting attention. I mean, I think in terms of, I think thinking creatively about how things are financed is starting to get more attention, and I think it will, because I think the fluidity of the conversation with regards to ownership is really important, because these assets, both the infrastructure and the vehicles themselves, we know a fair amount, but we still don't know all that is to know about the long-term viability. And so I think it's just we're all taking some level of risk. And so I think if we could get more savvy on who is best suited to own which infrastructure, and not just proliferating it for the sake of proliferation, but really thinking about the less enticing topics in that regard, on the sort of financing model, I think would be nice.
So that actually wraps up our audience questions. We do have a few minutes left. Ashely, do you have any closing thoughts around mobility, this topic?
I think it's exciting that we're talking about going to the moon, but I think that we need to focus on this planet too while we can. And so in closing, I think obviously we need to balance our lives and spend time with our families, but I think the more infusion of energy into this topic, the better. So I wouldn't hesitate to welcome anybody to reach out to me and look to Greenlots or anybody else within this industry to help propel this movement even further and faster. I know I'm not a very patient person, so it takes some patience, but it's a very exciting time to be a part of it, and let's increase diversity in this space as well.
I actually had one more thing. You are an EV owner, and I feel like the only way to get people to actually buy EVs is to have EV owners tell them to do that. What if you were to make a sales pitch right now to the audience on why they should get an electric vehicle, what would it be?
Oh gosh. Well, I have a Nissan Leaf, but I've driven a Tesla. I've driven pretty much any type of EV that you can imagine. I've had a Tesla. I think that for me, the motivation is being able to make a personal impact right now, and to be able to see that impact both in your community, but then also being a part of that larger effort. And then kind of the simple things is like my son can fall asleep on a nap in the car, which is kind of nice because he doesn't have to breathe in fumes. Mm-hmm. And just the quiet is honestly like, and it's a really smooth ride. I much prefer it to, I won't say the name to throw anybody under the bus, but we have two cars. One is an ICE car. I'm looking forward to the day that we have both electric cars, but I can tell you right now that my son prefers our electric car, and my husband and I both prefer the electric version of our cars. So I think you will never go back once you get an electric car. I know, Erin, you did like a road trip in a Tesla too, so you know.
Yes, that unfortunately was not my car. I did not own that Tesla, and it was so hard to go back to driving my ICE vehicle after. It's just not the same.
Yeah.
But thank you, Ashely.
I was just going to say, I'm looking forward to the electric truck.
Mm-hmm.
I do a lot of things that require trucks, so I cannot wait for the array of products that are coming on board with trucks. So look forward to that.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent most of my life in Texas, and I can tell you, electric truck is going to increase in adoption anywhere in the South. I mean, that's what it's going to take. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We really appreciate your insights, and just thank you again.
Have a great day.